Before there was a United States mint, before there was a Lincoln cent or a Morgan dollar or a single eagle struck in gold, there was one small copper coin, the very first money issued by the authority of the United States of America, and its story is almost too fitting to believe. It was designed, the tradition says, by the most famous American alive. Its copper may have been scavenged from the discarded straps of French gunpowder kegs left over from the Revolution. The man who won the contract to make it bribed a government official, stole the government's copper, used it to strike more profitable coins for himself, and fled the country.
And the coin told every American who held it, in 3 plain words, exactly what it thought of all this. Mind your business. This is the story of the Fugio cent, the first coin of a new nation, born in idealism and corruption in equal measure.
To understand it, you have to understand how fragile the country actually was. In the 1780s, the United States barely existed. The war was won, but the nation was a loose bundle of 13 states held together by the Articles of Confederation. A weak central government with almost no power, unable even to reliably supply its people with money to spend. Coins were scarce. Foreign coins circulated alongside a chaos of state coppers, and paper money was so distrusted that people wanted something with real metal value in their hands. A nation isn't truly a nation until its people share a currency. And so, on April 21st, 1787, the same summer that men were gathering in Philadelphia to write the Constitution, the Congress of the Confederation authorized the country's first official coin, a humble copper penny. The design it chose was unlike anything a nation had ever put on its money. There were no kings here, no portraits of generals, no allegorical goddesses of liberty. Instead, on the front, a blazing sun shining down on a simple sundial, and beside it a single Latin word, Fugio. It means I flee or I fly, and paired with that sundial, it carried a quiet, powerful message. Time flies. And beneath the dial, in plain English, the instruction that gave the coin its soul, mind your business. It was part financial advice and part life philosophy. Watch your affairs, tend to your work, don't waste the hours you're given. On the back, 13 interlinked rings, one for each state, encircling a small center that read, "We are one," a chain where every link depends on the others, a fragile new union, telling itself it would hold. And here is the first great question that hangs over this coin. Did Benjamin Franklin design it? The tradition says yes. It's so widely believed that the coin has been called the Franklin cent for well over a century. And the case is genuinely strong. Years earlier, in 1776, a patterned coin called the Continental Dollar had appeared bearing nearly this exact design. The same sun and sundial, the same mind your business, the same linked rings, and we are one. That earlier piece is itself often attributed to Franklin. The sentiments are pure Franklin, the thrift, the industry, the homespun wisdom that reads like a line lifted straight out of Poor Richard's almanac. Franklin loved sundials. Franklin loved a pithy motto. It sounds like him in every syllable. But here's the honest truth that most retellings skip. No one has ever found solid proof. There is no surviving letter, no signed sketch, no congressional record that plainly says Franklin drew it. The attribution rests on the style, the resemblance to that earlier coin, and the sheer fact that it sounds like something he would say. It may well be his. It probably reflects his ideas. But it lives in that honest borderland between documented history and beautiful tradition. And the coin is better, not worse, for the mystery. America's first coin may have sprung from the mind of its most quotable founder, or it may simply speak his language so fluently that we can't help but hear his voice. Now the copper itself carries a legend worth pausing on. one of those details that sounds too poetic to be real. According to a story repeated for generations, much of the copper used to strike these first American coins came from a very particular source: the metal bands and straps that had bound together kegs of gunpowder sent by France to help the American cause during the Revolution. If it's true, and it's one of those threads passed down more as tradition than as proven fact, then think about what that means. The powder that helped win American independence came in kegs bound with copper. And when the war was over, that same copper was melted down and stamped into the first coins of the country it had helped set free, the metal of war reforged into the money of peace. It's the kind of story that's almost too neat, and it deserves that little grain of caution. But it has clung to this coin for a very long time, and it captures something real about a broke young nation making its money out of whatever it could find. But if the design was idealism, the manufacturing was pure corruption. And this is where the Fugio cent stops being a civics lesson and becomes a crime story. The contract to actually produce 300 tons of these coins went to a Connecticut businessman named James Jarvis. And Jarvis did not win it honestly. He secured the contract by paying a bribe, reportedly $10,000, an enormous sum at the time, to a man named William Dewar, the head of the Board of Treasury, the very official responsible for overseeing the nation's coinage. The first coin of a republic founded on liberty and virtue was, from its very first day, tangled up in graft at the highest level of the Treasury. And it got worse. To get production started, the government did Jarvis a favor. It loaned him roughly 30 tons of federal copper up front, trusting that he'd pay it back once the coins were made. Jarvis promptly sailed off to Europe to hunt for more copper and struck a deal, if he could, with the great Matthew Boulton and his famous Soho Mint in England. He left the operation back home in the hands of his father-in-law, a man named Samuel Broome, and Broome saw an opportunity. Rather than turn the government's copper into Fugio cents, as the contract demanded, he used most of it to strike something far more profitable for the family: hundreds of thousands, by some accounts millions, of Connecticut state coppers, which were lighter, cheaper to make, and pocketed a bigger margin. He was, in the plainest terms, using the federal government's own copper to counterfeit up profits for himself, while barely making the coins he'd been paid to make. The numbers are staggering in how badly the contract failed. Jarvis had promised 300 tons of Fugio cents. In the end, only around 4 tons were ever delivered to the Treasury. Roughly 400,000 coins, a tiny fraction of the promise. And the government had never been paid back for the 30 tons of copper it had loaned out. When Congress finally realized the full extent of it, the underdelivery, the missing copper, the whole rotten arrangement, it voided Jarvis's contract in the autumn of 1788, and Jarvis and Broome did what men in their position have always done. They fled to Europe to escape the reckoning, leaving the young nation holding the bill. America's first coin maker was, functionally, a fugitive. Fugio indeed. The man himself fled. So the great irony sits right there on the coin's face. Mind your business. It lectured the citizen holding it, while the men who made it robbed the public treasury blind and skipped the country. A coin preaching thrift and honest industry, produced through bribery and theft. You could not write a sharper little parable about the gap between a nation's ideals and its realities, and it's stamped into the very first money the United States ever made. Because so few were struck and the whole enterprise collapsed, the Fugio cent barely circulated. A copper panic was already driving down the value of coppers, and these pennies largely sank into obscurity almost as soon as they appeared. And that should have been the end of the story, and a beautiful, doomed, corrupt little coin, mostly forgotten. Except the Fugio cent had one more strange chapter waiting, and it's the reason you can still hold one today without being a millionaire. Sometime around 1788, a keg, an entire barrel of brand new, uncirculated Fugio cents, came into the possession of the Bank of New York, and there in the bank's basement it simply sat, forgotten, for decades. The nation grew up around it, the Constitution ratified, the mint founded in 1792, presidents come and gone, and all the while a barrel of the country's first coin slept untouched in a vault. It wasn't rediscovered until 1856, when the bank moved locations and someone cracked open a long-lost keg to find thousands of pristine 1787 pennies. The coins were poured into cotton bags and then, almost unbelievably, forgotten a second time until they surfaced again in 1926. Eventually, the bank began handing them out as souvenirs to favored customers and later selling them to collectors. It's why so many surviving Fugio cents are in remarkably fine condition. They never circulated, never wore down, never passed from grubby hand to grubby hand. They spent the 19th and early 20th centuries asleep in a bank, the way the coin's own motto might have advised, quietly minding their own business. There's even a twist for the collectors, a trap for the unwary. In the 1850s, around the time that first keg was rediscovered, someone created a fresh set of dies and struck brand new Fugio cents, the so-called New Haven restrikes made decades after the originals, some even in silver and gold. For years they were romantically believed to have come from rediscovered original dies. In truth, they appear to be a later fantasy production, struck at a Connecticut factory and passed into the hobby. Today, collectors distinguish them by tiny details, the shape of the letters, the thickness of the rings on the reverse. Even the first coin of the United States, it turns out, spawned its own imitations and mysteries. The story of the Fugio cent refuses to end cleanly, and maybe that's fitting. So consider everything pressed into that one modest disc of copper. It was the first coin of a new republic, possibly drawn by Benjamin Franklin himself, stamped with a sundial and a warning that time flies. It carried a philosophy of thrift and unity. Mind your business, we are one. Onto the money of a country that was still barely learning how to be a country. Its copper may have come from the powder kegs of the Revolution. It was born through a bribe, gutted by theft, and abandoned by the very men who made it. And then it slept in a bank basement for the better part of 2 centuries, waiting to be found. It was a failure as currency and a masterpiece as a symbol. The Fugio cent is where American money begins, and not in triumph, but in a very human tangle of high ideals and low deeds, sunlight and shadow, struck into copper and handed to a young nation with a single piece of advice. Mind your business. Time is flying. We are one.